In the early years of World War II, the Atlantic Ocean had become a graveyard. German U-boats prowled beneath the waves, hunting Allied supply ships like wolves in the dark. Every day, new radio reports crackled through static. Convoys sunk, crews lost, supplies gone. Britain was starving. Its lifeline to America was being cut, link by link, ship by ship. And the United States, still not yet in the war, couldn't build replacements fast enough. For every ship launched, 5 are being sunk. At this rate, the Allies would collapse before they could even fight back. But in that moment of despair, salvation came from the most unlikely of men. A man who had never built a ship. A man who wasn't a general, nor an engineer. He wasn't even part of the Navy. He was just a builder. His name was Henry Kaiser. He was 58 years old, balding, overweight, soft-spoken. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and a felt hat he never took off. By all appearances, an ordinary businessman. But behind those quiet eyes was a storm. Henry Kaiser believed in one thing above all else, that the word impossible was just another challenge waiting to be destroyed. He once said, "The minute they tell me it can't be done, that's when I know I'm..." Before the war, Kaiser was known as the man who built the impossible. When the Great Depression crushed America, he was one of the few still building bridges, roads, and dams so huge they reshaped the land itself. He helped construct Hoover Dam, Grand Coulee, and Bonneville, projects that gave jobs to tens of thousands of starving workers. He had no formal engineering degree, no fancy education, just a relentless hunger to make things happen. And when he looked at the chaos of war, he saw opportunity, not for profit, but for purpose. If America's shipyards couldn't build fast enough, he would show them how. In 1940, Kaiser attended a meeting in Washington, D.C. The Maritime Commission had called the nation's biggest shipbuilders to figure out how to produce more cargo vessels for Britain. They debated designs, budgets, and timelines. They argued about logistics, about what couldn't be done. Then, from the back of the room, a voice cut through the noise. "I can build you a ship faster than anyone in this room." Heads turned. Someone laughed. Who was this man? Kaiser stood tall and calm. He explained his plan. He would build ships the same way Ford built cars, on an assembly line. Instead of constructing a vessel piece by piece in one place, he would divide it into sections. Prefabricated parts, the bow, the stern, the engine room, each built separately at the same time by specialized crews. Once ready, those sections would be welded together like giant puzzle pieces. The experts scoffed. Ships weren't cars, they said. Each one was unique. Handcrafted. Complex. You can't match. But Kaiser didn't blink. He simply smiled and said, "Gentlemen, that's what they said about Hoover Dam." The commission didn't believe him, but they were desperate, so they gave him a small contract, just a few ships. A test. He took it, and he promised to do the impossible. Back in California, he began building something that had never existed before, a shipyard designed not for tradition, but for speed. He chose a location on the edge of the San Francisco Bay, in a small town called Richmond. There, he built the foundation of what would soon become the beating heart of America's wartime industry. In the beginning, there was nothing but mud, cranes, and vision. But in a matter of months, that empty land became a living organism. Richmond Shipyard Number 1. Kaiser's philosophy was simple: build fast, build together, and never let fear slow you down. He didn't hire seasoned shipbuilders. He hired anyone willing to work. Men who had never seen the ocean. Women who had never held a torch. Farmers, carpenters, miners, secretaries, it didn't matter. If they could work, they could build. He trained them all from scratch. Within weeks, thousands of new workers flooded in, hammering, welding, lifting steel. The old shipbuilding elite laughed. They called his recruits amateurs. They called his ideas madness. But Kaiser didn't care what they said, because he wasn't building ships the old way. He was building a new kind of war machine, one powered by belief. And it worked. By the end of 1941, the first ships from Richmond were sliding into the bay, built in half the time and half the cost of any traditional yard. Kaiser's methods were working faster than anyone thought possible. But he wasn't satisfied. He told his managers, "If we can build one in 50 days, we can do it in 30. If we can do 30, we can do 20. Every time they broke a record, he demanded a new one. Every barrier they crossed only made him hungrier. The secret wasn't just in the process, it was in the people. Kaiser treated his workers differently. He saw them not as tools, but as partners. He gave them medical care when no one else would. He built on-site daycare centers for mothers who wanted to work. He opened cafeterias that served hot meals for a nickel. He gave them pride, purpose, and power. He once said, "If you take care of your people, they'll take care of your dreams." And his people loved him for it. They called him the chief. And under his leadership, the shipyard became a symbol of hope, proof that ordinary Americans could do extraordinary. But Kaiser's methods still had enemies. Traditional shipbuilders accused him of rushing, of sacrificing quality for speed. When one Liberty ship cracked in two during a storm, they pounced. They said it proved that welding didn't work, that Kaiser's shortcuts were dangerous. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply fixed it. He ordered every problem studied, every weakness reinforced. And while the critics were still talking, he built 2 more ships faster than ever. By 1942, Richmond Shipyard had become a machine of miracles. But Kaiser wasn't done yet. He wanted to prove that the impossible could be beaten completely. One morning, he gathered his managers and said, "We're going to build a full Liberty ship in 1 week." The room went silent. 1 week? That was insane. Even by Kaiser standards, it couldn't be done. But he didn't ask for permission. He gave an order. 7 days, he said. Let's make it happen. The news spread across the country. Reporters came to watch. Other shipyards called it a publicity stunt. But Kaiser's workers knew better. They worked in shifts around the clock. Spotlights lit up the yard at night, turning the darkness into day. Welders moved like dancers, sparks flying in golden rain. Each piece of a ship came together like clockwork. On the 4th day, a banner appeared on the half-finished hull. 4 days or bust. By then, it wasn't just work. It was war, a race against time. And Henry Kaiser was right there with them, walking the yard, shaking hands, smiling through exhaustion. He didn't command with fear. And then, on November 12, 1942, they did it. The SS Robert E. Peary was ready for launch. A fully functional, ocean-going cargo ship, built not in months, not in weeks, but in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. When it slid into the water, the crowd erupted. Bands played. Cameras flashed. Workers cheered until their throats went hoarse. For the first time, the impossible had been proven wrong in front of the entire world. The newspapers called it the miracle ship. America called it hope. As the Pearies sailed out into the bay, Kaiser stood quietly at the dock, hands in pockets, watching. A reporter asked how it felt. He simply said, "We just proved it can be done." He never boasted. He never took the credit. He always said it was the workers who did it. The welders, the riveters, the women and men who refused to quit. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. Without Henry Kaiser, none of it would have happened. By the end of the war, his shipyards would build nearly 1,500 Liberty ships, and his methods would reshape every corner of American industry. But in that moment, on that November morning, one man without a uniform, without a rank, had just changed the course of the war. He didn't fight with bullets or bombs. He fought with ideas. And his greatest weapon was time, because Henry Kaiser didn't just build ships. By 1940, the situation was dire. The Atlantic was a battlefield no one could see. German U-boats hunted merchant ships like predators in the dark. Every week, new reports came in. Ships sunk, supplies lost, lives gone. Britain, the lone standing force against Hitler in Europe, depended on these convoys. They needed food, fuel, weapons, tanks, airplanes, ammunition, everything to survive. And America's shipyards couldn't keep up. The truth was grim. For every ship that launched, 5 more were lost. At this rate, Britain's lifeline would collapse before the Allies could even mount a serious defense. The existing shipbuilding system was slow, rigid, and steeped in tradition. Shipyards worked like centuries-old workshops, each vessel hand-built from keel to deck. Every ship was unique. Every ship was a labor of meticulous craft. Each one took months, sometimes almost a year, to complete. In the middle of this, the United States faced a stark reality. If it didn't find a way to build ships faster, the war could be lost before it began. The Maritime Commission tried everything. They expanded existing shipyards. They imported new steel. They hired more workers. But the results were disappointing. Ships took too long to build. Costs ballooned. Workers burned out. Output lagged. American officials were desperate. The British pleaded for faster production. The Germans, meanwhile, were relentless, sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. It was a numbers game, and America was losing. Then Henry Kaiser stepped in. Kaiser looked at the disaster not as a problem, but as a challenge. He didn't see failure. He saw inefficiency, bureaucracy, and wasted time. And he knew that if he could apply his experience building dams and bridges, he could do the impossible, transform shipbuilding from a slow, handcrafted art into a machine. He envisioned a system where ships weren't built piece by piece in one place. Instead, each ship would be broken into sections, prefabricated simultaneously, then welded together. The bow here, the stern there, the engine room somewhere else, all arriving on time, ready to assemble like a giant puzzle. It was a radical idea. Engineers shook their heads. Ships aren't cars, they said. You can't mass-produce the ocean. But Kaiser didn't argue. He just wanted to work. He leased land along the San Francisco Bay and began constructing Richmond Shipyard No. 1. It was a massive site, carefully designed for efficiency. Cranes lifted enormous steel sections. Workers in shifts labored day and night, their hands raw, their faces blackened with soot. Kaiser's methods were controversial. Traditional shipbuilders accused him of cutting corners. They said his prefabricated sections would never hold in rough seas. They said welding was dangerous and untested for such enormous vessels. But Kaiser didn't just ignore them. He solved the problems as they arose. He tested new welding techniques, reinforced weak points, and constantly pushed for speed without sacrificing strength. Within months, his first ships were launched. They were faster, stronger, and cheaper than any ship the United States had ever produced. But Kaiser wasn't satisfied. Speed alone wasn't enough. He needed efficiency at scale. He expanded his operations. 7 shipyards would eventually rise along the U.S. coast, each one a model of industrial precision, each one a testament to his vision that ordinary Americans could do extraordinary things. And he didn't just focus on speed. Thousands of workers were recruited, many with no prior shipbuilding experience. Women, minorities, and older men were all trained to work the ships. He opened daycare centers, medical clinics, and cafeterias. He created a workforce motivated not just by paychecks, but by pride and purpose. The results were staggering. Liberty ships that had once taken months to build now took weeks. Every month, the output increased. Every ship that sailed strengthened the Allies' hold on the Atlantic. But even with this progress, the challenges remained enormous. Steel shortages, labor strikes, supply chain delays. The war's demands never ceased. Each day brought new pressure to build faster, to deliver more. The fate of nations rested on the assembly lines of Richmond and other shipyards. The military watched closely. Some were skeptical. Some were amazed. The world had never seen anything like it. By 1942, the stakes were higher than ever. Britain was counting on America. Hitler's submarines continued their deadly raids. The war was global, relentless, and unforgiving. And Henry Kaiser stood at the center of it all, a civilian with no uniform, no rank, but a vision that could win the war without firing a single shot. He had transformed disaster into opportunity. He had turned failing shipyards into machines of mass production. And he was just getting started. Soon, the world would witness the greatest industrial feat in human history, the construction of a Liberty ship in just 4 days. A feat that would prove, once and for all, that innovation, determination, and courage could overcome even the most impossible odds. Henry Kaiser was not a soldier. He was not a general. He was the man who redefined the front lines of war. And the world would never forget By the summer of 1940, it was clear that America's traditional shipyards could not meet the demands of a world at war. Every convoy lost at sea tightened the noose around Britain. Every sunken freighter added pressure on the Allies. The clock was ticking, and the United States had to act, or risk letting history be written by those who built faster, fought harder, and sank ships with impunity. Into this chaos stepped Henry Kaiser, a man no one had expected to shape the war effort. He was not a naval engineer. He had never commanded men on a battlefield. He had never built a ship. Yet, in his mind, he saw a path forward, one that would overturn centuries of naval tradition and redefine what was possible. Kaiser had spent his life building impossible things: dams that held back rivers, roads that carved through mountains, and bridges that spanned valleys. The size of the task never intimidated him. He had learned early that if you could organize people, materials, and machines efficiently, you could achieve what others said could not be done. And now, the war demanded nothing less than a miracle. He called a meeting with his engineers and managers. The topic was simple: speed. The goal was audacious: build ships faster than ever before. Not a few weeks faster, not a few days faster, much faster. Impossible faster. Kaiser outlined his plan, and it was met with disbelief. He proposed a concept that most shipbuilders would have considered blasphemous: build ships like cars. Prefabricate each part of the vessel in separate sections, have multiple teams construct them simultaneously, and then weld them together on a massive assembly line. Welding, one engineer scoffed. Ships are made with rivets. Welding will crack the hulls. They will fail in the ocean. And what are the crews? Asked another. Who will operate these assembly lines? Kaiser didn't answer immediately. He let the questions hang in the air, then calmly said, "We will train them. We will experiment. We will solve the problems. That is what we do. That is what must be done." His audacity stunned them. His confidence was contagious. Some were inspired. Others were terrified. But every one of them understood one thing. This was a man who did not fear impossibility. The idea itself was revolutionary. Traditional shipbuilding relied on a linear process. One ship, one team, one keel, one bow, built in painstaking sequence. It was slow, laborious, and prone to human error. Every hull was a custom project. Every deck a labor of love. And while the ships were beautiful, they were not fast enough for the demands of a world war. Kaiser's method turned that approach on its head. Ships would be divided into prefabricated sections: the bow, the stern, the engine room, the superstructure. Each section would be constructed simultaneously in separate workshops, then delivered to the assembly dock where massive cranes would place them in position. Teams of welders would fuse these pieces together with precision. The skeptics were relentless. "You can't mass-produce ships," they said. "The ocean will destroy them. You're playing with lives. You will fail." Kaiser responded with a single, steady reply: "Then we will make them stronger, faster, and better. If it can't be done, it will be done." To implement his vision, Kaiser purchased land along the San Francisco Bay. He transformed empty mudflats into Richmond Shipyard No. 1. It was a blank canvas, free from tradition, bureaucracy, or the constraints of old naval practices. He built massive cranes, warehouses, and workshops. He designed the yard to optimize flow. Steel plates entered on one side, sections were fabricated in the middle, and finished hulls emerged on the other. Every bolt, every weld, every worker was timed, measured, and placed to max. The workforce was unprecedented. Tens of thousands of Americans came to Richmond to work on the ships. Many had no experience in shipbuilding. Women learned to weld. Farmers learned to assemble engines. Teenagers handled cranes. Immigrants, minorities, and veterans worked side by side, unified by purpose. Kaiser knew the human element was as critical as the engineering. He provided medical clinics, cafeterias, daycare centers, and training schools. He treated his workers as partners in the mission. In doing so, he created a motivated, loyal, and skilled workforce capable of extraordinary feats. By mid-1941, the first ships began to roll out of Richmond. They were slower than he wanted at first. There were mistakes, broken welds, and sections that didn't fit perfectly. Each failure, however, became a lesson. Kaiser analyzed every error, refined every process, and pushed his teams to improve. Within months, the pace accelerated. Ships that once took 250 days to build were now completed in fewer than 50. Efficiency skyrocketed and morale soared. The impossible was becoming reality. But even as Richmond's shipyard proved the concept, Kaiser was already thinking bigger. He wanted to test the limits of human and industrial endurance. He set a goal that seemed insane: construct a full Liberty ship in 1 week. His engineers panicked. 7 days? That is absurd. We cannot do it. Kaiser simply nodded. Then we will. Find a way. The decision was more than a test of engineering. It was a test of will. Richmond became a battlefield of industry. Workers labored in shifts around the clock. Floodlights turned the night into day. Sparks flew from welders' torches. Steel plates moved on cranes like pieces. The entire shipyard moved in perfect, synchronized rhythm. Every worker, every welder, every supervisor was a part of a single machine. The energy was electric. There was no room for fear, only focus. The news spread quickly. Reporters came to witness the experiment. Critics from other shipyards ridiculed the idea. It will never work, they said. It is a stunt, a gamble that will fail. But Kaiser had anticipated this. The doubters did not matter. The workers did, and the workers believed. By November 1942, the stage was set. The ship was the SS Robert E. Peary. It was to become the world's fastest-built Liberty ship, a vessel that would redefine what humanity could accomplish in times of crisis. On day one, the keel was laid. Massive cranes lifted prefabricated sections into position. Welders worked tirelessly, fusing steel under blistering conditions. Sections arrived precisely when needed. Mistakes were corrected in real time. Every process was tracked, every movement choreographed. By day 2, the hull began to take shape. By day 3, it was already recognizable as a ship. Floodlights illuminated the yard at night as welders worked tirelessly, sparks dancing like fireflies across the darkness. The pace was relentless. Workers painted a banner on the hull that read, 4 days or bust. And on the morning of day 4, the SS Robert E. Peary was complete. 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes. A full cargo ship, ready for war, built in a fraction of the time anyone thought possible. When it slid into the bay, the crowd erupted. Reporters shouted. Photographers snapped pictures. Workers cheered until their voices were hoarse. Henry Kaiser stood at the edge of the dock, hands in his pockets, quiet and proud. A reporter asked how it felt. He replied simply, "We just..." That day, history changed. The rules of shipbuilding were rewritten. The concept of impossible had been shattered. Kaiser's methods would eventually produce over 1,400 Liberty ships, supplying the Allied war effort on an unprecedented scale. His vision, his audacity, and his leadership proved that one man's ideas, combined with a committed workforce, could change the course of a global conflict. He had taken disaster and transformed it into opportunity. He had taken skepticism and turned it into achievement. He had taken ordinary people and made them extraordinary. The world was watching, and Henry Kaiser, the civilian with no uniform, no rank, and no battlefield, had just become one of the most important figures in the industrial war effort. The impossible had been done. The crazy idea that no one believed in had become reality, and there was still much more to come. By late 1942, the world was at war, and the pressure on American industry had reached a breaking point. Britain was struggling to survive. The Atlantic was littered with the remains of merchant convoys, sunk mercilessly by German U-boats. Every day, supplies that could mean the difference between survival and surrender were lost to the sea. The Allies needed ships, and they needed them fast. Henry Kaiser understood the stakes. Traditional shipyards could not keep up. Ships that once took months to build simply could not be produced quickly enough. The war demanded a solution that went beyond ordinary thinking. Kaiser had already proven that prefabrication and assembly line methods could accelerate production, but he wanted to push the limits of what was humanly possible. He envisioned a feat that seemed unimaginable, constructing a fully functional Liberty ship in just 4 days. Not weeks, not months, for days. It was audacious, reckless even. Most engineers thought it impossible. Skeptics called it madness. But Kaiser, the ship chosen for this unprecedented challenge was the SS Robert E. Peary. It would become a symbol of what determination, organization, and innovation could achieve when combined. Kaiser assembled his best engineers, supervisors, and workers and laid out the plan with meticulous precision. Every section, every bolt, every weld had to be timed to the minute. There could be no errors, no delays, no wasted motion. Construction began on November 8, 1942. The keel was laid before dawn. Massive cranes lifted prefabricated sections into place as welders began their work. Sections of the hull, the engine room, and the superstructure had been prepared in separate workshops, each team working simultaneously. The pace was relentless. Every minute mattered. Every movement had to be coordinated. Workers labored in shifts around the clock. Floodlights turned night into day. Sparks from welding torches illuminated the shipyard like fireworks, reflecting off steel plates and water puddles. The energy was electric. Everyone understood the importance of the task. There was no room for mistakes and no room for hesitation. On the second day, the hull began to take shape. The bow, stern, and midsection were welded together with precision. The work was exhausting, but morale remained high. Kaiser moved among the workers, encouraging them quietly, observing the process, and ensuring that every piece of the plan was executed flawlessly. His presence was steadying. Workers called him the chief, and they believed in his vision. By the third day, the ship was fully recognizable. Decks were in place. Engines were installed. The superstructure rose like a monument to human ingenuity. Workers painted a banner across the hull, 4 days or bust. It was both a challenge and a statement, a declaration that they would meet the final day arrived. Welders, carpenters, electricians, and engineers worked tirelessly. Every bolt, every seam, every connection had to be inspected, corrected, and perfected. The assembly line choreography had to be flawless. One misstep could delay the launch, jeopardize the experiment, and invite ridicule from skeptics worldwide. And then, after 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, the SS Robert E. Peary was complete. A fully functional Liberty ship ready to sail. The feat was unprecedented. The workers erupted in cheers. Reporters shouted. Cameras flashed. Floodlights illuminated the steel hull, reflecting the faces of exhausted but triumphant men and women. Kaiser stood at the edge of the dock, watching silently. A reporter asked how it felt to witness such a miracle. He replied simply, "We just proved it can be done." The SS Robert E. Peary was more than a ship. It was a statement. It was proof that with vision, organization, and relentless determination, even the impossible could be achieved. It was a symbol of American ingenuity and industrial might. News of the achievement spread quickly. Headlines celebrated the 4-day miracle ship. Engineers marveled at the feat. Workers were proud of their contribution to history. The world had never seen anything like it. But the real impact of this achievement went beyond publicity. The methods used to build the Peary became a blueprint for mass production of Liberty ships across the United States. Prefabrication, assembly line coordination, and innovative welding techniques accelerated production to levels previously unimaginable. By the end of the war, over 1,400 Liberty ships had been constructed, many using the techniques. The shipyard was transformed into a well-oiled machine of industrial efficiency. Workers learned skills that allowed them to contribute more than ever before. Women, immigrants, and minorities who had once been excluded from heavy industry became essential contributors to the war effort. Kaiser's vision had reshaped not just shipbuilding but the workforce itself. The four-day miracle ship demonstrated the power of bold thinking and fearless leadership. It showed that innovation could overcome skepticism, that determination could overcome obstacles, and that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary feats when given the tools, training, and belief in their mission. Even the skeptics had to admit, Henry Kaiser had changed the game. He had redefined what was possible in shipbuilding and in human effort. He had proven that with courage, vision, and relentless work, a single man's ideas could alter the course of history. The SS Robert E. Peary would serve in the Atlantic, delivering supplies to Allied forces, a tangible result of a dream, a plan, and the audacity to do what no one else believed could be done. It was a ship built in record time, but it represented far more than speed. It represented hope, ingenuity, and the indomitable spirit of a nation determined to survive. And for Henry Kaiser, the four-day miracle ship was just the beginning. It was proof that the impossible could be beaten, and that ordinary people, guided by extraordinary vision, could shape the outcome of a world at war. The lessons of the Peary would ripple across the globe. Shipyards everywhere would adopt similar methods. Industries beyond shipbuilding would learn that speed, efficiency, and innovation were not mutually exclusive. The war would be won not only on battlefields, but in factories, on assembly lines, and in shipyards where the impossible became reality. The four-day miracle ship had proven one essential truth. In times of crisis, vision, courage, and relentless determination can turn disaster into opportunity and make legends out of ordinary men and women. Henry Kaiser had not just built a ship. He had built a miracle. By the winter of 1943, Henry Kaiser's shipyards had become more than just factories. They were symbols of what America could achieve when pushed to the edge. What began as a desperate gamble to mass-produce Liberty ships had evolved into a global lifeline. Every vessel launched from Richmond carried not just cargo, but the beating heart of an industrial revolution. Each ship was a promise that the Allied forces would never run out of the supplies they needed to fight, a promise that no matter how many ships the enemy sank, there would always be another on the horizon, a promise that the might of democracy was not only in its armies, but in its factories. As Kaiser's yards roared with the sound of progress, the ships they built began to change the course of the war. Convoys once vulnerable and underprotected now grew stronger, faster, more resilient. What had once been a terrifying journey across the Atlantic was slowly transforming into a coordinated flow of unstoppable logistics. Each Liberty ship carried tons of cargo: food, fuel, munitions, tanks, planes, and hope. They delivered life to the war zones where soldiers fought and died every day. They brought reinforcements to the Pacific, weapons to North Africa, and supplies to the beaches of Europe. They became the arteries through which Allied power pulsed, feeding the war effort from one side of the world to the other. Kaiser's miracle had reached the front lines. But behind every ship's arrival, behind every successful convoy, was the relentless grind. The workers at Richmond Shipyard No. 1 labored around the clock. Rain or shine, day or night, they forged steel into salvation. Welders stood shoulder to shoulder, sparks flying, faces hidden behind thick masks. Crane operators moved entire sections of ships as easily as toys. Foremen shouted over the thunder of machinery, timing every step, every weld, every movement. The shipyard was alive, a living, breathing organism of purpose. For every man on the front lines, there were 10 behind the lines, keeping him supplied, protected, and alive. And Henry Kaiser understood that better than anyone. He often walked the yards at night, his shoes echoing against steel plates, the air filled with the sound of hammering and welding. He didn't shout orders or give speeches. He just observed, nodding at workers, offering a quiet word of encouragement. He understood that these people, men and women, young and old, were fighting a different kind of war. Not with rifles and bullets, but with steel and fire. He made sure they were cared for. He built medical clinics directly inside the shipyard, something unheard of at the time. He introduced on-site childcare so mothers could work without fear for their children. He provided hot meals, warm clothes, and proper rest areas. He knew that to win a war, you had to keep your army healthy, and his army wore overalls. From those innovations, a legacy was born. Kaiser's medical program for his workers would later evolve into Kaiser Permanente, one of America's first large-scale healthcare systems. It was born not from corporate greed, but from necessity, compassion, and efficiency. It was another example of how one man's vision could ripple far beyond the battlefield. Meanwhile, the ships kept coming. In 1943 alone, more than 500 Liberty ships were launched from American shipyards. The Richmond yards were producing a new ship every few days. The numbers were staggering, the scale unimaginable. At one point, Kaiser's yards employed over 90,000 workers, one of the largest industrial workforces on Earth. And every ship mattered. The convoys crossing the Atlantic began to turn the tide. Where once U-boats had free rein, now the hunters became the hunted. Armed escorts, radar systems, and air patrols worked in tandem with the endless flow of new ships. Even when one went down, two more took its place. This was Kaiser's true genius. He understood that the war could be won with logistics, by building faster, smarter, and better than the enemy could destroy. He had turned American industry into a weapon more powerful than any bomb. The Liberty ships were not glamorous. They were simple, rugged, and often described as ugly ducklings. But they were strong, dependable, and everywhere. They carried the lifeblood of the Allied war effort across oceans. Every soldier who ate, every pilot who flew, every tank that rolled, owed part of their existence to the shipyards. As the war expanded into Europe, the demand only grew. The invasion of Sicily, the Italian campaign, the Pacific Island assaults. Each operation required mountains of supplies, delivered on time, every time. The Liberty ships were the silent soldiers of the war, unheralded, tireless, and essential. And as America's shipyards grew faster, the world began to notice. British officials visited Richmond and were stunned by what they saw. Hundreds of ships in various stages of completion, welders working side by side, sections of vessels lined up like parts on an assembly line. It was a sight that defied imagination. They returned home convinced that America's industrial capacity would win the war. Even the Germans knew. Reports from their intelligence networks spoke of an unstoppable wave of American ships. Hitler himself reportedly fumed that for every U-boat victory, 10 more Allied ships seemed to appear. He could not comprehend how the Americans were building so much so fast. But Henry Kaiser knew. It was not just the machines. It was the people. The workers were no longer just laborers. They were patriots. Every ship they finished carried their sweat, their pride, and their determination. They knew what they were building would save lives. They understood that every rivet mattered, every weld counted, every hour. And Kaiser's leadership kept that spirit alive. He rewarded efficiency. He celebrated milestones. He spoke to his workers not as subordinates, but as equals in a common mission. When the SS Robert E. Peary was completed in 4 days, he made sure every worker knew they were part of something historic. He also knew that speed without quality meant nothing. So he demanded excellence, ships that would not just float but endure. And they did. Many Liberty ships outlasted the war itself, serving for decades afterward. As D-Day approached in 1944, Liberty ships carried the supplies that made the invasion possible. Tanks, ammunition, trucks, food, all loaded onto vessels born in the shipyards of America. When the beaches of Normandy erupted with chaos, it was Henry Kaiser's ships that fed the front lines, that brought reinforcements, that turned the tide. The soldiers on those beaches never met Henry Kaiser. They didn't know his name, but they owed him their survival. His ships were the veins that carried their lifeblood. His shipyards were the heart that kept it pumping. By 1945, when the war began to draw to a close, the numbers spoke for themselves. Kaiser's shipyards had built over 1,400 Liberty ships, nearly one every other day at the peak of production. Each one a small miracle of engineering, determination, and human will. The Kaiser fleet, as it came to be called, had carried millions of tons of cargo across oceans, under fire, through storms, and into history. They were not just ships. They were the physical manifestation of an... And as the guns fell silent, as the world began to rebuild, Henry Kaiser looked at his shipyards and saw something more than metal and machinery. He saw what people could achieve when they were united by purpose. He saw what vision could accomplish when matched with courage. He saw proof that America's strength was not just in its weapons, but in its workers. Kaiser had taken ordinary citizens, mechanics, mothers, farmers, welders, and turned them into warriors of industry. He had shown that the front lines were not just in Europe or the Pacific. They were in the factories, the foundries, the shipyards. They were anywhere people refused to give up. And as the world celebrated victory, Kaiser quietly stepped back from the spotlight. He didn't claim glory. He didn't ask for recognition. He simply knew that he had done his part. From shipyards to battlefronts, Henry Kaiser's vision had changed everything. The war had been fought with courage and sacrifice, but it had been won with ingenuity, speed, and the unstoppable will of ordinary people who believed in something bigger than themselves. And though his ships would eventually rust and fade, his legacy would not. Because long after the guns went silent, the lessons he taught the world remained. That in times of crisis, innovation is power. That in times of fear, leadership is courage. And that in the darkest hours, when all seems lost, one man's idea, one impossible dream, can light the... By 1944, the roar of American industry had become the soundtrack of war. Factories thundered day and night. Trains carried steel instead of passengers. Every whistle, every weld, every spark was a note in a symphony of survival. And at the center of that symphony stood one idea, an idea born not in the White House or in a general's tent, but in the mind of a single civilian, Henry J. Kaiser. The world had changed. The war that once seemed far away now stretched across every horizon. The Pacific burned. Europe bled. Africa struggled for breath. And yet, from the smokestacks of America came the one thing that could turn despair into hope: production. It wasn't just about ships anymore. It was about everything. Planes, tanks, trucks, guns, ammunition, fuel, the raw machinery of freedom, the tools that would forge victory from chaos. They called it the arsenal of democracy, a phrase first spoken by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in a fireside chat. But it was men like Kaiser who made it real, because words could inspire. Factories could win wars. Kaiser had already done the impossible with ships. Now he set his sights on something bigger, the entire system of wartime production itself. He believed America could outbuild the Axis, not by luck, not by manpower alone, but by method, by mindset. He understood something few others did at the time, that America's greatest weapon wasn't the bomb or the bullet. It was... In the early months of 1944, Kaiser's reputation was legend. He had taken an untrained civilian workforce and turned them into a force of industrial nature. Now, government officials came to him with the question, if you can build ships that fast, can you help us build everything else? Kaiser didn't hesitate. He knew how to move mountains, and this was just another one. He began coordinating with automotive giants, Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors. He studied how Henry Ford had built Model Ts and applied those lessons to tanks, jeeps, and aircraft. What emerged was a revolution in efficiency. Entire factories were reorganized into living organisms of motion. One department cut steel, another welded frames, another fitted engines. And as each step flowed seamlessly into the next, the miracle of mass production became the heartbeat of war. The Detroit River echoed with the thunder of progress. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, built with Kaiser's principles, was so large it had its own mile-long assembly line for bombers. B-24 Liberators rolled out at a rate the world had never seen. By 1944, one bomber was leaving the factory every 63 minutes. A plane that once took months to build was now airborne in less than a day. That was the arsenal of democracy. Kaiser's influence spread beyond factories. He began applying his methods to housing and logistics, designing prefabricated barracks, airstrips, and even hospitals that could be assembled in days. His approach was simple but revolutionary. Plan ahead, build in parts, assemble fast, deliver results. He believed that war production wasn't just about speed, it was about morale. Every worker needed to feel the weight of their contribution. So Kaiser encouraged communities to take pride in what they produced. He visited factories, shaking hands with welders, machinists, secretaries, cooks. He told them the truth. You are as vital to this war as any soldier in the field. And people believed him, because he wasn't a politician. He was one of them. By mid-1944, American factories were producing more than the entire Axis combined. Every hour brought new ships, new planes, new tanks. The sheer volume defied comprehension. At its peak, the United States produced over 100,000 aircraft a year, 50,000 tanks, and tens of thousands of ships, vehicles, and guns. Kaiser's shipyard alone had built 27% of America's entire merchant fleet. But his real achievement wasn't just the numbers, it was the philosophy that made them possible. He had proven that innovation could defeat intimidation, that creativity could overcome chaos, that civilians could outfight generals if given the tools and trust. The phrase Kaiser time became a badge of honor. It meant working faster, thinking smarter, breaking limits. It meant believing that impossible was just another word for. Meanwhile, across the ocean, those same ships and planes were changing the shape of war. In Europe, Eisenhower's armies pushed toward Berlin. In the Pacific, island after island fell under American assault. Behind every advance was a tide of supplies so vast it seemed endless. The D-Day invasion alone required over 5,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft. Most of those ships were built in yards inspired or managed by Kaiser's methods. Every landing craft that touched the beaches of Normandy, every supply ship that followed, it was all part of a network of logistics that stretched back to the American heartland. The war was not just fought with courage. It was won with organization. But Kaiser wasn't done. Even as Allied troops stormed across Europe, he was already thinking about what came next. He believed the world after war would need rebuilding, and fast. He envisioned a peacetime America that could use its industrial power not for destruction, but for creation. Housing, hospitals, infrastructure, airports. He imagined the same techniques that built Liberty ships being used to build homes for returning soldiers. And he was right. Within months of the war's end, Kaiser's shipyards pivoted to peacetime production. The same factories that once forged steel hulls now built homes, cars, and tools for a world desperate. But let's pause for a moment and look deeper, because this chapter of history isn't just about one man's success. It's about the spirit of an entire generation. When Roosevelt called America the arsenal of democracy, it wasn't a metaphor. It was a mission. Every American household became part of it. Women took jobs once reserved for men. Children collected scrap metal. Farmers worked longer hours. Entire towns competed to produce more, build faster, save lives. Rosie the Riveter became a national icon, not because she was fictional, but because she represented millions of real women who rolled up their sleeves and built the war machine that saved civilization. And behind it all, people like Kaiser gave them the framework to succeed. He took the impossible and made it a system. He turned chaos into choreography. He transformed hope into hardware. Still, the weight of that production came with a cost. Fatigue, accidents, pressure beyond measure. Workers toiled through exhaustion, their hands blistered, their lungs filled with steel dust. But they kept going, because they knew what failure meant. They knew that every delay, every broken weld, could mean lives lost overseas. They didn't just build machines, they built lifelines. In those years, something beautiful happened in America, a unity that transcended politics, class, and race. In Kaiser's shipyards, black, white, and immigrant workers stood side by side. They didn't always share the same beliefs, but they shared the same goal: to win. And for a moment in history, that was enough to bind. As the tide of war turned, the numbers began to tell a story no general could ignore. In 1942, America had been on the defensive. By 1944, it was unstoppable. The enemy could no longer replace what it lost, while America could replace it twice over. Factories became fortresses. Welders became warriors. Rivets became bullets. The arsenal of democracy wasn't a place, it was a movement. It lived in every machine shop, every steel mill, every person who refused to quit. And Kaiser stood as its symbol, not because he was perfect, but because he believed. He believed in the power of ordinary people to achieve extraordinary things. When victory finally came in 1945, the celebrations echoed from the Pacific to the Atlantic. The war was over. The ships that had carried the fight now brought home the peace. And the world turned its eyes back to the man who had helped make it possible. Henry Kaiser stood quietly at the edge of a dock one morning, watching a Liberty ship glide out to sea for the last time. He didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He just watched, hands folded, lost in thought. He knew that the ship wasn't just steel. It was a monument to human ingenuity, sacrifice, and hope. He turned to one of his engineers and said softly, "If we can do this for war, imagine what we can do for peace." And with that, he began the next chapter of his life, building cars, homes, hospitals, and industries that would shape post-war America. Because for Henry Kaiser, the end of war wasn't the end of innovation. It was just the beginning of another. The arsenal of democracy didn't end in 1945. Its echo lives on. Every time a factory line hums. Every time innovation overcomes fear. Every time ordinary people rise to extraordinary challenges. The lesson Henry Kaiser left behind is as relevant now as it was then. Then in the darkest times, the light doesn't come from heroes. It comes from builders, from dreamers, from people who refuse to say it can't be done. And that was the power of the arsenal of democracy. A power forged not by generals, but by the hands of the people. A power that proved one truth above all, that freedom can be built. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent, the world breathed again. The oceans that once carried death now shimmered with peace. Cities began to rebuild. Factories turned their furnaces toward creation, not destruction. And in the quiet that followed, one man stood at the crossroads of history, Henry Kaiser. He had entered the war as a builder. He left it as a symbol of what humanity could achieve when it refused to surrender. But Henry Kaiser was not finished. In fact, for him, the end of war was the beginning of a new kind of challenge, a different kind of battle, one that would test not just his skill, but his imagination. Because now he wanted to. Kaiser looked around and saw a world shattered, millions without homes, nations without infrastructure, people without hope. He believed that the same industrial genius that had built fleets of ships could rebuild lives. And so, he began again, just as boldly as before. His first mission was housing. Returning soldiers flooded back to America. They had fought for freedom, but came home to crowded cities, empty lots, and little opportunity. Kaiser wanted to give them something more than gratitude. He wanted to give them roofs. Using the same prefabrication techniques he had pioneered in his shipyards, he began designing affordable homes that could be built fast, cheap, and strong. Entire neighborhoods rose seemingly overnight. Neat rows of modern, simple houses for veterans and their families. He called them victory homes. They were symbols of a new era, a promise that peace could be built as quickly as war. But Kaiser didn't stop there. He turned his eye toward another battlefront. During the war, his shipyards had employed tens of thousands of workers. To keep them healthy and productive, he had built clinics on site. Doctors, nurses, preventative care. It was an idea born of necessity, but it became something revolutionary. Now, he wanted to take that same model and offer it to everyone, not just his employees, not just the privileged, but to ordinary Americans. In 1945, Henry Kaiser founded Kaiser Permanente, a healthcare system based on efficiency, accessibility, and fairness. His philosophy was simple. A healthy worker is a productive worker. A healthy nation is an unstoppable one. At a time when most Americans paid for healthcare out of pocket, Kaiser's model offered something radical: group plans, prepaid coverage, and modern medical facilities under one system. It was the birth of a new era in American medicine. And it came not from a doctor or politician, but from a builder. He wasn't trying to change healthcare for profit. He was trying to make life better, to make health as universal. But peace, like war, has its own complexities. Kaiser's vision was ambitious, too ambitious for some. Critics called him naive. Business rivals called him reckless. Bankers said he was dreaming too big again. They said his ideas wouldn't last, that America was moving back to business as usual. But Henry Kaiser had never believed in usual. He believed in impossible, and he had already proven what impossible could do. So he kept building. He moved into industries no one expected: cars, aluminum, cement, even television. He became one of the first industrialists to see the future of plastics and lightweight metals. He built the Hoover Dam. He financed the construction of highways. And he poured his fortune into science, education, and public good. He wasn't chasing wealth. He was chasing impact. By the 1950s, Henry Kaiser had become a legend, not just of industry, but of imagination. He was known as the man who gets things done. A man who could take an idea from sketch to steel in a fraction of the time others even debated it. Presidents called him for advice. Generals respected him. Workers idolized him. And yet, through it all, Kaiser remained remarkably grounded. He wasn't a man of speeches. He was a man of blueprints. He preferred the sound of welding torches to applause. He once said, "Find what people need and give it to them faster than they expect." That was his secret. Not luck. Not power, vision. But behind every success, there was a question that haunted him. What if humanity could unite for creation the way it once united for war? He believed that same energy, the coordination, the innovation, the drive, could solve anything. Poverty, disease, hunger. He saw war as proof not of destruction, but of potential. Because if mankind could mobilize so completely to fight, then surely it could mobilize to build. That became his life's mission. And though not every idea succeeded, the spirit behind them all endured. Kaiser's ventures were vast and varied. He launched Kaiser Motors, producing sleek, futuristic cars in the post-war boom. He built Kaiser Aluminum, which revolutionized lightweight manufacturing. He created Kaiser Steel, helping to power America's growing cities. Every project was another expression of the same belief, that progress should never stop. And when people asked him what drove him, he smiled and said, "I just want to leave the world better than I found it." He did. As the years passed, the world he helped build began to forget the details, but never the results. Every highway that crossed the country, every modern hospital, every prefabricated home, they all carried pieces of his DNA. His fingerprints were in the infrastructure of the modern world. The Liberty ships he had built for war became cargo ships for peace, carrying goods instead of guns. His hospitals expanded across states. His industrial systems inspired generations of engineers. And his philosophy, that innovation is the highest form of patriotism, became a silent creed for creation. In 1967, Henry Kaiser passed away. He was 85 years old. He left behind a nation transformed and a legacy that stretched across continents. When news of his death spread, the tributes came not from politicians, but from workers, from welders who remembered his shipyards, from doctors who worked in his hospitals, from families who lived in homes he built. They remembered not just what he made, but what he made possible. To this day, historians call him the father of modern American industry. But perhaps his greatest title came not from history books, but from his workers. They called him the man who built for humanity. Because Henry Kaiser never built for glory. He built for people, for the common man, for the belief that greatness was not the privilege of the few, but the product of the many. And in that belief, he captured something eternal. Decades later, when historians look back at the 20th century, they see two sides of human nature, the side that destroys and the side that creates. And in the balance between those two, Henry Kaiser stands as proof that creation can win. He showed the world that industry was not just about machines. It was about imagination. That leadership was not about power. It was about trust. That progress was not about speed. It was about purpose. His shipyards may have fallen silent. His factories may have closed. But the idea that drove them all still lives on. That one person with courage and vision can change the fate of millions. That the greatest victories are not won on battlefields, but in the hearts and hands of those who build. Henry Kaiser never called himself a hero, but in a world torn apart by war, he gave humanity something to believe in again. Not through speeches, not through politics, but through steel, sweat, and unstoppable will. He built not for war. He built for peace. And that